Welcome to my channel, where creativity meets originality. I'm here to bring you content that stands out, keeps you engaged, and maybe even surprises you. If that sounds like your vibe, go ahead and subscribe. You won't regret it.
Growing up, I never thought much about being the older one. It seemed natural. The firstborn sets the example, takes the harder road, earns things the slow way. My father always said that with a straight face, like it was wisdom instead of an excuse. I believed him for a long time, longer than I should have. My parents were working people. My father spent 30 years as a shift supervisor at a packaging plant outside of Columbus, Ohio. My mother cleaned houses 3 days a week and managed ours the other 4. They weren't wealthy, but they weren't struggling either. They had 2 sons in a modest brick house on a quiet street, and by most measures, that looked like a decent life. My brother Derek came along 4 years after me. I was old enough to remember the day they brought him home. How my mother held him like he was made of something rare. How my father stood taller just looking at him. I didn't think much of it then. Babies get attention. That's how it works. But the attention never really shifted back. By the time I was 12 and Derek was 8, the pattern was already set in stone. I'd come home with a report card full of A's, and my mother would say, "That's what you're supposed to do," and go back to whatever she was doing. Derek would scrape together a C- average, and my father would take him out for ice cream to celebrate his effort. I watched that happen more times than I can count. I stopped bringing my report cards home after a while. In high school, I worked a part-time job at a hardware store on weekends. I saved enough to buy my own school supplies, my own clothes for junior year, my own everything. Derek got a car for his 16th birthday. A used one, sure, but still a car. I rode the bus until I was 19. I don't tell you all of this to make you feel sorry for me. I tell you because it explains something about who I became. Someone who put his head down and earned things quietly. Someone who didn't expect applause. Someone who trusted the people closest to him, maybe more than was wise. I put myself through 2 years of community college, transferred to Ohio State, and finished a degree in accounting. I got hired at a mid-sized consulting firm in Cincinnati. I built something real, something that was entirely mine with no help from anyone. I met my wife Caroline when I was 31. She was a project manager at a construction company, sharp and funny and incredibly grounded. We met at a mutual friend's cookout, argued about baseball for 40 minutes, and exchanged numbers at the end of the night. By our 3rd date, I already knew she was different from anyone I'd ever spent time with. She saw me. Not the older son who was supposed to set an example, not the responsible one who would handle whatever came up. Just me. We dated for 2 years. I proposed on a Saturday morning in a park we used to walk through on weekends. No big performance. Just the 2 of us and a ring I'd been carrying in my jacket pocket for 3 weeks, waiting for a moment that felt honest. She said yes before I finished the sentence. Derek was my best man. I asked him because he was my brother, and because, despite everything from growing up, I genuinely believed that as adults we had moved past most of it. He'd cleaned himself up after a rough stretch in his mid-20s, gotten a job in sales, seemed to be doing fine. We weren't close exactly, but we were civil. We had dinners with my parents twice a year, exchanged texts on birthdays, watched football together on Thanksgiving. I thought that was a working relationship between brothers. I thought I understood what I had. I didn't. Caroline and I got married in the fall. It was a small wedding, about 60 people, an outdoor venue outside the city, the kind of evening where everything looks golden in the late October light. I remember standing at the end of that aisle, watching her walk toward me and feeling something settle in my chest. Like a thing I'd been holding tight for years had finally let go. We bought a house the following spring. Nothing extravagant. A 3-bedroom in a good neighborhood, a backyard, a garage. We talked about kids in an easy, unhurried way. We were happy. I want to say that clearly, because what comes next tends to shadow everything before it if you're not careful. We were genuinely, quietly happy. The first time I noticed something off was about 8 months into the marriage. Caroline started keeping her phone face down. I'd see her pick it up at odd hours, read something, put it away without saying anything. She'd always been open. She was the kind of person who read texts out loud in the car just to share them. So the change was small, but it registered. I told myself I was being paranoid. Told myself that privacy was normal, that not everything had to be shared, that I was inventing problems where there weren't any. Then Derek started coming around more. He'd always had a decent relationship with Caroline. They got along at family events, exchanged the kind of light banter that people who share someone they both care about tend to develop. but it started to feel like he was finding reasons to be there when I wasn't. He'd stop by the house on a weekday afternoon, when he knew I was at work, to drop something off, or check on the gutters, after I'd mentioned the previous month that I needed to get them cleaned out. Little things, each one explainable. Together they added up to something I kept refusing to name. I named it on a Tuesday night in November. I'd left my laptop at the office and driven back after dinner to get it. When I came home, Derek's truck was in the driveway. I sat in my car for a moment trying to come up with a reason that made sense. There was no reason. I walked inside. I won't describe what I found in detail. Some things you don't need spelled out. What I will tell you is that it was exactly what I feared. And at the moment I stepped into that hallway and the sound of my footsteps made them both go silent, something in me went very, very cold. Caroline came out first. Her face was the face of someone who'd been rehearsing this moment and had forgotten everything they'd prepared. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I stood in my own hallway in my own house and I said, with a voice I barely recognized as mine, "Get out of my house, both of you." Derek tried to speak. I looked at him, my brother, my best man, the person who stood beside me the day I got married, and I said it again, "Get out." He left. Caroline tried to stay. She reached for my arm and I stepped back and told her to go sleep somewhere else tonight and that we'd figure out the rest in the morning. She went to a hotel. I sat in the kitchen until 3 in the morning staring at the countertop we picked out together at a Home Depot on a Saturday last April, and I tried to understand what my life had just become. The next morning I called a lawyer before I called anyone else. That was the first smart decision I made in the middle of all of it, and I'm glad I made it early. Caroline came back that afternoon. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me it had been going on for 2 months. She said it started at my parents' house, at a Sunday dinner I'd left early because of a work call. She said she didn't know how it happened. She said she was confused and that Derek had been there and that he'd said things. She said she was sorry. She said it like she expected that word to carry more weight than it possibly could. I asked her one question. I said, "Did you ever think about stopping?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I tried." I told her I needed her to leave the house while we figured out the legal side of things. She asked if there was any chance we could work through it. I looked at her for a moment, this woman I'd built something real with, and I felt the full weight of what had been taken from me. Not just the marriage, not just the trust, but the specific, private happiness we'd had that nobody else knew about. That was gone. You can't walk that back. I told her no. I called Derek that evening. He answered on the second ring. He sounded like he'd been waiting. He started with, "I'm sorry," which I already knew would be the first thing out of his mouth. Then he followed it with, "I didn't plan for this to happen," which is what people say when they want credit for the absence of premeditation while avoiding accountability for all the choices they made along the way. I told him I wasn't calling to hear him explain himself. I was calling to tell him that as far as I was concerned, we were done. Not the kind of done that needs a dramatic speech. Just done. The way you turn off a light when you leave a room. He said, "You can't just cut me out. I'm your brother." I said, "You made that word mean something I can't recover from." Then I called my parents. My mother answered. I told her what had happened. There was a silence that lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "Derek told us there were problems in your marriage before this." I sat with that sentence for a moment. "Derek told you," I repeated. He said Caroline wasn't happy, she said. He was just, "Stop," I said. "I'm going to need you to hear what I'm telling you. Your son slept with my wife. In my house. For 2 months. And you're telling me what Derek said?" My father got on the line then. His opening was, "This is a family matter, and family handles things privately." I told him I didn't need advice on how to handle it. I needed them to understand what had happened. My father said that I was letting my emotions get ahead of my judgment. My mother said that Derek was going through a hard time. I hung up before I said something that couldn't be unsaid. Over the next 2 weeks, I focused on 3 things: the legal process, my work, and my own stability. My lawyer filed the divorce paperwork. I documented everything, the timeline Caroline had given me, the text between her and Derek that I'd found after the fact, the visit logs. I was building a wall between what was mine and what wasn't, brick by brick, and I needed the structure of it. My parents called 6 times that first week. I let it go to voicemail each time. The messages were variations on the same theme, that I was being reactive, that family forgives, that I needed to consider how this was affecting everyone involved. Not once in any of those messages did anyone ask how I was. I went to the gym one morning about 3 weeks after everything came out. I was on the treadmill, working through it physically the way you do, when your mind won't give you a break, when my phone buzzed on the console. A text from Derek. I know you don't want to talk. I just want you to know that Caroline and I aren't together. It's over. I thought you should know. I stared at that text for the length of a full minute. Then I put my phone face down, finished my run, showered, and went to work. I didn't respond. I want to be clear about why. It wasn't anger in that moment. Or at least not only anger. It was clarity. Derek telling me his thing with Caroline had ended wasn't information that changed anything about what had happened. He'd made his choices. The aftermath of those choices wasn't something I owed him updates on. But I'd made a mistake during those weeks. I hadn't enforced the distance I'd set. Derek had my number. My parents had my address. I was still reachable in all the ways that made me vulnerable to being pulled back in. That changed the morning my mother showed up at my office. I was in a client meeting when my assistant knocked and handed me a folded note. Your mother is in the lobby. She's asking the receptionist about you. I excused myself, walked out to the lobby, and found my mother standing at the front desk with what looked like a container of food, and the particular expression she'd worn my whole childhood when she wanted something and had decided warmth was the right tactic. I thought we could have lunch, she said. I looked at her for a moment. Then I walked her outside, stood on the sidewalk, and told her clearly that she could not come to my workplace. That what she had just done was not appropriate. That if she needed to contact me, she needed to call or text and wait for me to respond. She started crying. Real tears, not performed ones. My mother has never been a manipulative crier, which made it harder. She told me she missed me. She told me the family was falling apart. She told me Derek was struggling. I told her I understood that she was in pain. I told her I was in pain too, and that mine had a specific cause that involved her son. I told her that I needed her to respect my space while I dealt with the legal side of the divorce. I told her that if she came to my office again, I would be forced to speak to building security. She left. I went back to my meeting. I stayed an hour late that night making up the time I'd lost. My lawyer had recommended early on that I consider a formal cease and desist letter to Derek and potentially to my parents if the contact continued. I'd been reluctant because a letter like that makes everything official in a way that felt permanent. But the office visit changed my thinking. There is a difference between wanting distance and enforcing it, and I had been too long in the territory of wanting it without the enforcement. I had the letters sent that week, 3 of them, one to Derek, one to my parents, one to Caroline through her own attorney since the divorce was already in process. The letters were quiet and legal and clear. They outlined what contact was acceptable going forward and what wasn't, and what I would do if the boundary was crossed. Derek tested it once. He called from an unknown number about 10 days later. I recognized his voice in the first syllable and hung up. I documented the call and sent a note to my lawyer. I never heard from him again after that. My parents were harder. They respected the letter for about 3 weeks, then my father sent a long email that walked right up to the edge of what the letter prohibited without technically crossing it. He talked about legacy and family and the choices I would regret. He said that whatever Caroline had done, she was still my wife, and that men worked through hard things. I forwarded it to my lawyer. We sent a follow-up letter. The email stopped. What I want to tell you about that period, the 4 months between finding out and the divorce being finalized, is that it was the most structurally sound I'd ever been in my life while simultaneously being the hardest. I had a lawyer. I had documentation. I had a system. What I didn't have was anyone who fully understood what it feels like to have the 2 people who were supposed to be the constants in your life, your brother and your wife, become the axis of your worst moment. My friend Gary had known me since college. He was the one who showed up at my apartment 2 weeks after everything happened with a 6-pack and a pizza and no expectation that I say anything. He's the kind of person who understands that presence is sometimes more useful than words. I don't know what that stretch would have looked like without him. I also started seeing a therapist every Tuesday at 6:30. It was my sister-in-law's suggestion, not Derek's wife, I should clarify. Gary's wife, Sarah, who'd been a steady presence through all of it, she said it very plainly. You've been self-sufficient your whole life, and that's a strength, but you're going to need to talk to someone who isn't part of this. She was right. The divorce was finalized on a gray Wednesday in early spring. I sat in my lawyer's office and signed my name several times and walked out into the cold with the particular empty feeling of a thing that's been finished but hasn't yet been replaced by anything else. I stood on the sidewalk for a minute. Then I went and got a very good cup of coffee at a place I liked nearby, sat by the window, and let myself feel all of it. The grief, the anger, the relief, the strangeness of being 43 years old and starting over in a house I'd originally bought with someone else in mind. I stayed in Cincinnati. I had considered leaving. There were moments in the thick of it when a clean start somewhere no one knew my name sounded like the only bearable option. But my work was there, my friends were there, and at some point I decided that leaving felt too much like the town had beaten me. I wasn't going to give it that. I threw myself into work in a way that was honest rather than escapist. I took on a major account that required long hours and genuine concentration, and there is something steadying about being required to think hard about something completely unrelated to your own life. I got promoted 8 months after the divorce. Nobody at the office made a ceremony of it. My manager called me into his office, told me the news, shook my hand, and that was that. I went back to my desk and finished what I was working on. It felt exactly right. A year after the divorce, I ran into someone at a work conference in Chicago. Her name was Renee. She was in risk management at a firm in Indianapolis, attended the same afternoon panel I did, and at the networking session afterward made a sharp observation about the keynote speaker that was so precisely correct that I turned around to see who'd said it. We ended up talking for 2 hours and missing the dinner we'd both technically been supposed to attend. I want to be careful here not to make it sound like a movie. It wasn't. I was not ready to fall in love with anyone at that conference. I was, at best, functional, healed enough to work and laugh and be present in the world, but still carrying the specific wariness of someone who had trusted completely and been handed back the pieces. Renee wasn't a solution to anything. She was just a person who was interesting and honest and didn't seem to want anything from me except conversation. We exchanged information. I emailed her 2 weeks later, which felt slightly formal, but also right. We met for dinner in Columbus, halfway between our cities, and talked for 3 hours about everything except our personal histories. The second time we had dinner, we talked about those too. She had her own history of complicated, a long relationship in her early 30s that had ended badly, a family that was well-meaning, but occasionally exhausting. She wasn't carrying it heavily. She'd done the work. But she understood the specific weight of having been genuinely hurt by someone you genuinely trusted. We dated for 1.5 years before anything became official in the way that things become official. There was no pressure and no timeline. We just kept showing up for each other in ways that gradually became indispensable. And somewhere in that process, we became us. I proposed on a Saturday evening on the back porch of the house she'd bought in Indianapolis right after dinner in the dark, with the string lights on and no audience. She laughed when she saw the ring, which was exactly the right response, and said yes while she was still laughing, which was even better. We got married the following October. Small ceremony, about 40 people, close friends and the family members worth keeping. Gary was my best man. He gave a toast that was funny and honest and made me laugh in the middle of it, which I hadn't expected. My parents were not invited. That decision took time to arrive at, but once I reached it, it was clear. It wasn't a punishment. It wasn't a statement. It was simply an accurate representation of what those relationships were. People who had chosen sides in a way I couldn't unsee, who had never once, in all the time that had passed, sat with the question of what their second son had actually been through. My mother sent a card to my address that arrived a week before the wedding. I set it aside unopened. Derek. I hadn't spoken to in 2.5 years. I had no information about his life and I wasn't looking for any. About 4 months after the wedding, Gary called me on a Sunday afternoon. He had something to tell me, he said, and he wasn't sure if I'd want to know. But he thought I'd rather hear it from him than from some other corner. Derek and Caroline had gotten together for a short time after everything fell apart. It hadn't lasted. Gary had heard through mutual connections that there had been some kind of falling out, that Caroline had moved out of a shared apartment, and Derek had apparently told anyone who would listen that she'd betrayed him. I sat with the extraordinary irony of that for a full minute. Derek using the word betrayed about someone doing to him a version of what he had done to me. I didn't feel victorious. I want to be honest about that. There's a version of this story where you hear that and feel something clean and satisfying, some cosmic ledger being balanced. What I actually felt was quieter than that. Tired, maybe. Unsurprised. A little sad for the general human capacity to keep making the same mistakes and still be shocked by the outcome. Renee was in the kitchen making coffee when I hung up. I walked in and she looked at me and said, "Everything okay?" I said, "Yeah, just some old news." She handed me a mug and went back to whatever she'd been doing, and I stood there in the kitchen of our house. Not a house I bought with someone else in mind. And I thought about the distance between where I'd stood in that other hallway on that November night and where I was standing now. The distance was not as far as I'd feared in the middle of it, and not as short as I'd hoped. It was the actual distance, the real, worked-for, specific mileage of a hard few years that had asked something of me and gotten it. I had paid for where I was. I knew what it cost. And standing in that kitchen, with the coffee and the quiet Sunday and Renee a few feet away, I was glad to have paid it. Some things don't deserve a complicated ending. Some things are just over, and what you build after them is the actual story. That's where I am now.